I think this is a very complicated and difficult problem. Let me give you a very extreme example. I come up here on Golden Gate Bridge and I see somebody getting ready to jump. He's going to commit suicide. Am I entitled to use physical coercion to stop him, assuming I'm capable of doing so? I think on the basis of the libertarian principle of not initiating coercion, one would have to say no. Yet I am sure that if most of you, like myself, if we could, would stop him. We'd grab him. We'd justify that temporarily by saying, well, really, he's behaving, he doesn't really intend to do that, and it's irreversible, and we got to stop him from doing something irreversible. Well, we grab him, we hold on to him, and he gives a perfectly plausible reason why we want to commit suicide. He wants to commit suicide. Are you going to let him go? I don't think that's very easy to answer that. In principle, we ought to say yes. And in practice, I doubt very much that many of us would really, assuming we had the power to hold him, would just let him go. I think what this demonstrates, fundamentally, is that no simple principle is really adequate. We do not have all the answers. And there is no simple formula that will give us all the answers. That's why humility, tolerance, is so basic, is so fundamental. Because the only way we can allow a process to go on whereby we can get a little closer and closer to those fundamental principles is by being tolerant, by recognizing and welcoming the opinions of people who fundamentally disagree with us. And yet, as I've already said, how do I square that with the example of intolerance on the part of people who deserve to be our heroes as libertarians? There's no doubt in my mind that no one has done more to spread the fundamental ideas of free markets than Ludwig von Mises. There's no doubt in my mind that few people, if anybody, nobody has done more to develop a popular following for many of these ideas than Ayn Rand. And yet there is no doubt that both of them were extremely intolerant. I recall a personal episode. At the first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society, the founding meeting in 1947 in Mont Pelerin, Switzerland, Ludwig von Mises, of course, was one of the people who was there. I was also, and we had a series of discussions on different topics, and one afternoon we had a discussion on problems of the distribution of income, taxes, progressive taxes, and so on. Now, I may say that the people in that room included Friedrich von Hayek, Fritz Machlup, George Stigler, Frank Knight, Henry Hazlitt, John Jukes, Lionel Robbins, Leonard Read, whom you referred to. Hardly a group of people you would regard as leftists. But in the middle of that discussion, von Mises got up and said, "You're all a bunch of socialists," and stomped out of the room. You need only read Barbara Brandon's book, a fascinating book on Ayn Rand, to recognize that what I've said applies to her. And she has a story in there which covers both Rand and von Mises. You may remember, but I'll read it to you in quote. One evening, the Hazlitts, that was Henry Hazlitt, whom I mentioned, invited Anne and Frank to dinner with Dr. and Mrs. von Mises. The evening was a disaster. It was the first time Anne had discussed moral philosophy in depth with either of the two men. My impression, she was to say, was that von Mises did not care to consider moral issues, and Henry was seriously committed to altruism. We argued quite violently. At one point, von Mises lost his patience and screamed at me. We did not part enemies, except for von Mises at the moment. About a year later, he and I met at a conservative dinner, and his wife made peace between us. The important thing to me is less the intolerance in personal behavior than it is that the philosophical doctrines on which they claim to base their views seem to me to be fundamentally a source of intolerance. So far as von Mises is concerned, that has to do with his methodological doctrine of praxeology. That's a fancy word, and it may seem highly irrelevant to my topic, but it isn't at all. Because the fundamental principle, his fundamental idea, was that we knew things about human action, the title of his famous book, because we are human beings and we have absolutely certain knowledge of the motivations of human action, and we can derive, he would have maintained that we could derive all of our substantive conclusions from our own basic knowledge. That facts, statistical or other kinds of evidence, cannot be used to test, simply illustrate a theory. That they don't test a theory, they cannot be used to contradict a theory, but because we know the propositions, we know the theoretical propositions, not because we are generalizing from observed evidence, but because we have innate knowledge of human motives and behavior. Now that converts anything that's done into a religion. It's not a scientific proposition. It's not something you can argue about. I have two people who believe that view, who share von Mises' praxeological view. And one says one thing and one says the other. How are they going to reconcile their difference? The only way they can do so is by argument on that basis. One has to say to the others, you've made a mistake in reasoning. And the other has to say, no, you've made a mistake in reasoning. And now they keep on going, and they never can persuade one another. There's only one thing left to do. You have to fight. The virtue of a modern scientific approach, from my point of view, of the kind of approach, to name still another name who deserves some place in the lexicon in the catalog of libertarians, is Karl Popper. And I think Popper's approach to methodology, also another Austrian, is very different. If you take a scientific approach, we finally disagree and we say to one another, well, look, you tell me what facts, which if they were observed, you would regard as sufficient to contradict your view. And and vice versa. And then you go out and see whether the evidence contradicts or supports the view you have. That's a way in which you can resolve issues without conflict. Well, so much for von Mises. That's a very brief statement, and I recognize that it doesn't do justice to either praxeology or or Popper. But that's not really relevant here. The same thing is true of Ayn Rand, as that phrase about altruism suggests. Rand did not regard facts as relevant as ways of testing her proposition. She derived everything from the basic proposition that A is A. A equals A, and from that follows everything. But if it does, again, suppose two objectivists, two disciples of Ayn Rand disagree, or a disciple disagrees with her. Both agree that A is A. There's no disagreement about that. But they, for one reason or another, have different views. How do they reconcile that difference? There is no way, and that's a basic reason why you have the kind of stories that Barbara Brandon talks about in her book, when she talks about what happened when people disagreed in any minute detail with Ayn Rand. So as I say, I feel there's an enormous paradox there. And don't misunderstand me. Nothing I say in any way lessens my admiration for the role which they both played in promoting the ideas of liberty and free markets. And yet I think they teach a positive lesson and a negative lesson. And the negative lesson is that we must beware of intolerance if we're really going to be effective in persuading people.